conquest of Persia by Alexander would have lasting consequences. When Alexander was on his deathbed, his generals pushed him to name who the throne should be granted. He would have responded, "To the strongest." This led to the fracture of the empire in four: Macedon and Greece, Thrace in the west of Anatolia, Persia proper with Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and Egypt, which also ruled over part of the Levant, Cyprus, and South Anatolia. The fragments of Alexander's empire would stay under Greek control or influence for most of the next 3 centuries. This period is referred to as the Hellenistic period. The local population would actually not see their life changed by much. It was mostly the aristocracy that changed into fully Greek, or a mix of Greek and Persian or local culture. A good example is the Ptolemy dynasty. Started by General Ptolemy, they would rule uninterrupted until Roman times, basing their power and military recruitment on Greek colonists, but also adopting local customs. The last member of this dynasty would be Cleopatra, the lover of Julius Caesar, ending the Ptolemaic rule with her death in 30 BC. This Hellenization would later see the rise of a Greek empire in Central Asia, the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom, which ironically would be the last surviving kingdom directly and culturally related to Alexander's conquest. So far from Greece, the Persian Empire soon turned into the Seleucid Empire, named after Alexander's general Seleucus. The Seleucid would be in a bitter rivalry with Ptolemaic Egypt. It would fail to hold on to the territory west of the Indus River and settle it as a natural border with the Indian Maurya people. The Seleucid would try to expand westward into Greece, but would be defeated by the Greeks and their Roman allies. This would weaken the empire and open it later to conquest by the Parthians. The Seleucid would turn out unable to hold on to their empire, with their most lasting legacy being the Hellenization of the region. That same process, pushed by a stream of an immigrant from Greece, would ultimately weaken the empire, with notably the Jewish population successfully rebelling. By the time of Christ, the Greek language would be used for language of learning, trade, and culture. The first Bible would be written in Greek as well. In the Near East and Iran, the Greek influence would slowly fade away, with a progressive return towards Iranian and Zoroastrian ideas. The Bactrians in Central Asia would turn out to be the last standing Hellenic kingdom, with a culture mixing Greek heritage and Buddhism, also called Greco-Buddhism. It is from this region that Buddhism spread toward China. The Parthians were an Iranic nomadic people, living in modern-day Turkmenistan, not unlike the Medes and Persian before them. They were ruled by the Seleucid through Greek satraps until they rebelled and took over the empire. The one to accomplish that was Mithridates I the Great. He started wars in the east to control the Greco-Bactrians in 155 BC, and then occupied the Indus Valley and wars in the west to try to expand into Greco-Roman territory. This follows a now familiar pattern in Persian history. First, there are some natural geographic features. A center of power always based around modern-day Iran, and trying to expand east towards Central and India, and west towards the Levant and Anatolia. Competent emperors manage to expand, bad ones see the empire contracting. When a dynasty really weakens, it gets replaced by nomadic invaders. First the Medes, then the Persians, and then the Parthians. For each nomad invasion, the pre-existing bureaucracy and lifestyle mostly stay unchanged, except maybe for the elite. The Parthian Empire was no exception. It is during this period that a full synthesis of Greek and Iranian culture would occur, and one good example of it is the cult of Mithra. Later on, Mithra would be a strong inspiration for the cult of Mithras by Roman legionaries. This cult would be competing with Christianity as a possible successor to the traditional Roman pagan gods. It was inspired by Mithra, but also incorporated a lot of other influences, including beliefs in astrology and divination. It was also a sort of secret society inside the Roman army, with multiple levels of initiation and secret hierarchy, a sort of martial Freemasonry. Going back to the Parthians, a unique feature of the Parthians was a ruling system that was a lot less autocratic. It was aristocratic, in the sense that only the elite had a say in the ruling of the country, but the nobility could decide to depose an unfit king by a vote, without the empire devolving into a civil war. Alternatively, even powerful nobles could be demoted or arrested by the king without troubles, as long as the decision was deemed fair enough. This gave Parthia a high level of political stability, something of an advantage against the always divided Greeks and the Romans, experiencing regular and devastating civil wars. Parthia would be a bitter rival to Rome, constantly blocking its expansion eastward. Parthian mounted archers would be a new core for the Persian Empire army, keeping alive the steppes tradition more than the previous nomadic invaders. Their most memorable tactic was the Parthian shot, a backward arrow fired at the pursuing enemy cavalry. In one especially remarkable military campaign, the Parthians would be responsible for the defeat and killing of Crassus, the third member of the triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey. They killed him in 53 BC by making him swallow melted gold in punishment for his legendary greed. The Sasanian Empire would be the last pagan, as in not Muslim, iteration of the Persian Empire. The best way to look at the Sasanian replacing the Parthian is by looking at the origin of the founders of the dynasty and their ideology. They were from an old Persian noble family, from the same region that Cyrus the Great came from. The empire they built from 224 AD would put back Iranian culture at the center of Persia, with Zoroastrianism turned into a state religion. Hellenization would partially stay, but be much weaker in Iran than in the fringes of the empire, like in the Near East neighbors such as Lebanon and Israel. Other religions would be tolerated, but this characteristic would be essential in distinguishing this new Persian Empire from the Roman Empire, now turning into a Christian empire. Later on, the Sasanian would be the most dangerous and threatening rival to the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire. It is during the Sasanian Empire that the Jewish Babylonian Talmud would be composed, as the empire harbored several Jewish centers of learning. The Sasanians saw the rise of Manichaeism, created by the prophet Mani. It was a religion claiming to be the final revelation, synthesizing the teaching of Zoroaster, Jesus, and Buddha. As a result, it angered the hierarchies of all the main religions of the time. Manichaeism would spread quickly, even if repressed by the Sasanian Empire's leadership, but would be ultimately crushed by the various governments in the West, China, and the Caliphates, and disappear completely by the 14th century. It would nevertheless be very influential on many Gnostic branches of Christianity like the Cathars. The Sasanian Empire would also be a lot more centralized and urbanized compared to the Parthian culture, more influenced by nomadic lifestyles. The Sasanian Empire would develop relations with the East further than the previous Persian Empire. Since the Bronze Age, trade with India and China had created a prosperous trade network, the Silk Road. It took its name from the invention of silk by the Chinese in the 4th millennium BC, and the beginning of its trade out of China from the time of the Persian Empire. The Sasanian and Chinese would also exchange artists, like musicians and dancers, and they cooperated in defending the Silk Road from the ever-present threat of nomadic pillagers from the center of Eurasia. They would also take over the trade with the Indian Ocean, kicking out the Romans from it. The Sasanian Empire is often described as the height of classical Persian culture, and a lot of their philosophy, architecture style, literature, and engineering would later be considered Muslim by foreigners, as the Sasanian style would be exported to the whole Muslim world. They might have even invented the very first electric battery, the so-called Baghdad battery. It was a pot with a metal component inside, able to generate electricity, similar to a AAA battery, and we have no idea what it was used for. Just when Muhammad was preaching Islam and federating the Arab tribes, the Sasanian and Byzantine empires had been fighting a multi-decade war of attrition against one another. A plague, known as the Plague of Shiro, also caused a lot of damage in 627 BC. Invasions by Turkish tribes reduced the military capacity of the Sasanian Empire as well. The weakening of the state for the wars had an especially dramatic effect on the Sasanian Empire. When the Sasanian king Khosrau II was killed by his rival, a civil war erupted, with up to 10 people claiming the throne. The civil war lasted 4 to 5 years, from 628 to 632 AD. Just when the civil war had ended, the Arab Muslims attacked and invaded Mesopotamia. It was repelled, but then a second attack in 636 AD took from the Sasanian control of all of the land west of modern-day Iran. In 642 AD, another attack started, and the empire would fall less than 10 years later. The Persians would rebel and attack Arab governors and garrisons, but ultimately their resistance would be crushed by reinforcements from the Arabic Peninsula. The conqueror would burn Zoroastrian sacred texts and force conversion on the local population. Many would flee and form the ancestors of the current-day Zoroastrian communities in India and elsewhere in Asia. Non-Muslims would have to pay a heavy tax called the jizya and could be enslaved. Nevertheless, it would take until the late Middle Age for Islam to become the dominant religion in Iran. This conquest of Persia by Arab Muslims was almost replicated against the Byzantine Empire at the same time. The resulting Rashidun Caliphate would control all of the Middle East, including Iran, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Mesopotamia, as well as parts of Central Asia. The relationship between Persia and Islam is complex. On one hand, Islam has been an imposed religion on the Persians, who resisted mass conversion for centuries. On the other hand, Persian culture has heavily influenced Islam itself. This is especially true for the branch of Islam that spread in Asia, including the Turks that would go on to form the mighty Ottoman Empire. It's fair to say that Islam has changed Persia, but also has not destroyed the uniqueness of the Persian civilization. No more than the invasion by Iranian people destroyed Elamite influence, or the Greek and Parthian conquests did eradicate the Persian culture. The caliphate that would take over the Rashidun Caliphate was the Umayyad Caliphate. While it was an Arab empire first, it also contained multiple elements of Persian culture as well, and drew a lot of its wealth and manpower from Persia and Mesopotamia. It also adopted the Persian administration and court protocol. The Umayyad Caliphate stretched at its peak in 750 AD from Central Asia to the Pyrenees Mountains in the north of modern-day Spain. The enormously overstretched Umayyad Caliphate soon started to fragment into more manageable smaller empires. This was also in part due to a split about who should succeed Muhammad. Due to the religious nature of Muhammad's empire, this split evolved into a religious split as well. Shia Muslims believe Muhammad appointed Ali, Muhammad's cousin, as his successor. Sunni Muslims believed he did not, as that Abu Bakr, appointed by a council of senior Muslims, was the rightful successor. This resulted in a bitter rivalry that is still alive to this day. Over time, this difference about political succession evolved into differences in theology and culture as well. Shia Islam would initially be most preeminent in Egypt and North Africa. Nowadays, Iran is considered the leader of the Shia world. It is often opposing the rest of the Muslim world in majority Sunni. The Umayyad Caliphate would be replaced by the Abbasid Caliphate. It was formed with the help of an Iranian general, and overall would progressively integrate better the old Persian culture and administration to the Arab rulers and their religion. The Abbasid would build Baghdad in 762 AD near the site of ancient Babylon. The city would see the building of the world's first paper mill, using Chinese-inspired technology, and become an important center of learning for the Muslim world. It would study, preserve, and copy Persian, Roman, and Greek texts. The Abbasids would also trade and exchange with the rest of the world, and contribute to the spread in the west of Asian inventions, like the sextant, the number 0, or gunpowder. The Abbasid Empire would struggle to maintain a grasp on a very large empire, and progressively lose control over the most distant parts. Morocco in the 830s, Egypt in the 870s, and North Africa in the 920s. From 945 to the 13th century, the area would become controlled by the Seljuk Turks, coming from the Eurasian steppes, like the multitude of Iranian tribes before them. Once again, the pattern of nomads replacing a declining dynasty still hold true. Even if Seljuks ruled, the Abbasids stay nominally in control of the empire. In practice, the Seljuks would control the state and the army, but the Iranian would control the administration. The Abbasid Empire is generally considered as having been the engine behind the Islamic Golden Age. It was a period of scientific development, building on previous knowledge from the Egyptian, Persian, Greek, and Roman, and on the exchange of ideas with all the cultures of Eurasia, from Western Europe to India and China. This led to considerable progress in various fields, like medicine, philosophy, astronomy, chemistry, geometry, physics, especially optics, and calculus, with the invention of algebra. A lot of the progress done in that time was also due to the work of minorities, like Zoroastrians, Christians, and Jews. Excluded from political power, they could still use their talents as doctors, scientists, and engineers. The Abbasids were also responsible for the production of some of the more well-known Muslim literature, like the 1001 Nights' Tales, likely at first a translation in Arabic of Persian texts, with origin in Indian literature. Additional folklore from Arabic, Persian, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian sources would be added to it. This is where iconic characters like Aladdin, Sinbad, or Ali Baba come from. As said before, the Seljuk rule in practice did not disrupt the daily functioning of the Abbasid Caliphate. The regular occurrence of nomads invading and replacing the previous dynasty ruling over Persia would be interrupted by the Mongol invasions. They differed from previous nomads' invasions by their scale and brutality. The Mongols would pillage and destroy most of the lands they conquered, culminating with the destruction of Baghdad in 1258. Many more cities than Baghdad were burned to the ground and their civilians slaughtered. The burning of Baghdad, the intellectual center of the Muslim Caliphate, is considered the end of the Islamic Golden Age. A considerable amount of libraries and other intellectual work, as well as mosques, were burned. Another difference between the Mongol invasion and previous nomads' invasions was the widespread destruction of qanats. Without these hard-to-build irrigation systems, many urban centers and agricultural lands would become uninhabitable. Persia recovered a little under the Mongol Ilkhanate that restored trade and repaired some of the irrigation infrastructures. During the occupation, the majority of the Mongols would convert to Islam. They would have a preference for Sufism, a sect of Islam with a predilection for esotericism and mysticism. In many ways, it blended well with the pre-existing Mongols' animist or Buddhist beliefs. Just when Persia was starting to recover, two events would wreck the region. The first reaching Iran in 1349, which would kill ultimately 30% of the population. The second was the invasion by Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane, in 1381. Timur would be the last great nomadic conqueror, and also one of the most brutal conquerors in history. He got his nickname due to injuries to his leg and 2 missing fingers from arrow wounds suffered in his youth. His tactic was simple. He would ask for unconditional surrender and nothing else. If refused, he would kill or enslave everyone on his path, including the elderly, women, and children. His campaign might have killed as many as 17 million people, a colossal amount equivalent to 5% of the world population at the time. At the time, many believed him to be a forerunner of the apocalypse, and maybe the horseman of war. In a paradox when considering his genocidal policies, Timur was also a great patron of the arts, especially architecture and poetry. Built on murder and violence, the Timurid Empire would fail less than a century after Timur's conquests. Persia would be partially ruled successfully by other nomadic tribes onwards, from 1452 AD. The Black Sheep Turkmen, or Karakoyunlu, would be followed by the White Sheep Turkmen, or Akkoyunlu in 1467 AD. The destruction and chaos brought by the successive Mongols' invasions had, maybe for the first time in millenniums, durably shattered the unity of Persia, including its Iranian heartland. The political disorder gave space for religious movements to grow in popularity and restore order. The most influential of them were of Shia inspiration, and the dominance of Shia Islam in Iran dates to this period. Shah Ismail was a religious leader and noble of mixed descent, with his ancestors Turkoman, Kurdish, Greek, and Georgian. In a way, this made him a perfect ruler for a land that had been conquered and assimilated so many diverse cultures into its own unique template. Similarly, the nascent Iranian-style Shia Islam would quickly integrate many Sufi orders into Shia Islam. This would increase permanently the theological difference between Iranian Shiism and Arabic Sunnism. Between 1501 and 1511, Shah Ismail would have reconstituted a Persian Empire, with familiar borders including Iran, the Caucasus, Turkmenistan, part of Afghanistan, and some control over Mesopotamia. The main struggle for the Safavid Empire would be their powerful western neighbor, the Ottoman Empire. While Iran was overrun by Timur and other nomadic tribes, the Turks had created a powerful empire in Anatolia that would succeed in the century-old goal of the Muslims' empire to conquer Constantinople. The Ottomans also controlled the Balkans, Greece, the Levant, and Egypt. At its peak, it would extend into North Africa and Ukraine and put Vienna under siege twice. Together, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughal empires would form the so-called Islamic gunpowder empires. Their expansion and armies were heavily based on the early mastery of gunpowder. They would form stable, rich, innovative, and expansionist empires. The Safavid Empire was a meritocratic society, where people might inherit the position of their father, but only if they prove worthy. The Safavids would have relatively friendly relations with the Mughals, as they were separated by the harsh mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan. On the opposite, the Safavid and Ottomans would regularly clash over the control of Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and East Anatolia. This rivalry with the Ottomans contributed to friendly relations with European powers. The Safavids, under Shah Abbas I the Great, would trade with the Dutch East India Company, and even establish an alliance with the Austrian Habsburgs. Abbas took back from the Ottomans Baghdad, eastern Anatolia, and Georgia by 1618. This military success had been made possible due to the modernization of the army, following the model of the British Army and under the instructions of Sir Robert Shirley. The relationship with England was well established, and it was with help from the British Royal Navy that Shah would kick out the Portuguese from Bahrain and Hormuz. Europe would also import from Persia the famous Persian carpets, silk, and other textiles. In general, living standards were equivalent to Europeans, at least for the commoners. However, Western visitors would notice fertile lands not being cultivated, blaming it on poor governance and a lack of interest in agriculture from the ruling elite. Many monuments in Iran standing to this date trace back to the Safavid period, including the several monumental and richly decorated mosques in Isfahan. Isfahan would be a center of learning. But by the mid-17th century, Islamic culture had started to stagnate. The emphasis on respecting older knowledge had turned into a reluctance to innovate or challenge previous assumptions. This would in turn put the country at a disadvantage to Europe, which had started to adopt the scientific method. Successors of Abbas I would prove a lot less competent and are remembered in history as more interested in wine and women than ruling their empire. This gave the neighboring powers increased ambitions, including Russia, which had now been a growing power for 2 centuries and actively expanding to the east and south. The Russian Empire under Peter the Great would conquer Iran's Caucasian territories in 1723. The regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan would also rebel against their Persian masters. Meanwhile, the Ottomans would also carve out a part of the Iranian territory. The Treaty of Constantinople in 1724 would briefly split Iranian territory between the Russians and the Ottomans. By 1735, most of these territories would be returned to Iran after a rebellion and a new Iran-Ottoman war. The man behind the restoration of an independent Iran in 1735, Nader Shah, would then attack India and pillage Delhi using the stolen riches to finance the reconquest of land long lost to the Ottomans. Over time, he would turn into a paranoid and cruel ruler. When he was assassinated in 1747, Persia controlled again the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and parts of Anatolia. What followed was a long period of anarchy and civil war. The winner of the civil war, who would found the Qajar dynasty in 1796, was Aga Muhammad Khan. His reign would be marked by the goal to re-establish Iranian control over the Caucasus. Like many other countries in that period, Iran would struggle to be independent when faced with increasingly powerful, industrialized, and aggressive European colonial empires. After Aga Muhammad Khan, Iran would permanently lose control over the region to Russia in the 2 Russo-Persian Wars of 1804 to 1813 and 1826 to 1828. And this was despite Russia fighting a very destructive war against Napoleon at the same time. Many Caucasian Muslims would refuse to live under Orthodox Russian rule and migrate to Iran. Later on, the ruling elite would essentially sell the country to foreign power influence, especially bidding Russia and England against each other. England, the colonial ruler of India, was increasingly on a collision course with Russia over the division of Central Asia and Persia. Several revolutions from 1905 to 1911 would weaken the rule of the Shah and increase demands for democratization. This would turn the old aristocratic Persia into the Iranian modern state, but also leave open to foreign domination. In 1907, the Anglo-Russia Convention would divide Iran into 2 zones of influence. The blatant disregard for the locals' opinion on the matter illustrates the loss of autonomy of Persia by that period. Foreign powers controlled the various factions, fighting for control of the country. The discovery of oil in 1908 contributed to increasing corruption and did little to help modernize and develop the country. In 1921, the UK would be struggling against the Soviet Union for control over Iran and its strategically important oil reserve. For the Soviets, access to the Indian Ocean and the ability to threaten English colonies in the Middle East and India was equally strategically important. With support from the British, Reza Khan would take power and establish the Pahlavi dynasty, which would rule until the 1979 revolution. Reza Khan would establish an authoritarian, nationalist, and militaristic government with a doctrine of secularism and anti-communism. Still, the company modernizes quickly. The authoritarian nature of the regime also made it prone to corruption and oppression. The secularism of the Shah's regime was resented by a devout population in majority Muslim, The tentative to westernized was also poorly accepted, including changes in clothing style, women's liberation, and many socio-economic reforms. During World War II, the Iranian government was initially tempted to side with the Germans. In response, the Soviet and English forces invaded the country. It would be a major transportation road for supplying the Soviet Union with American-made military equipment under the Lend-Lease Agreement. The post-war period would be marked by instability with the unresolved question of the relationship with Western powers. The new Shah, Mohammad Reza, initially ruled in a way that could have prefigured the country, turning it into a constitutional monarchy, akin to the UK or modern Spain. The relationship between the Shah and the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh would turn sour when the Prime Minister nationalized the British-controlled oil industry. Mossadegh was removed from power in 1952. Before being restored under popular pressure, he would be permanently removed from power in 1953 due to a USA and UK-sponsored coup. From 1953 to 1973, Iran's oil resources would be managed by Western companies. In 1973, in the midst of the 70s oil shock, the Shah would take back control of Iranian oil and use the money to modernize and build a more powerful army. In 1979, the country would be taken over by the Islamic Revolution, transforming the country into the Islamic Republic it is today. Communist activists that contributed to the success of the revolution would be quickly purged, resulting in poor relations between Islamic Iran and atheist communist Soviets. Iran would cut all relations with the West, with the Iran hostage crisis a focal point. 1 year later, Saddam Hussein hoped to profit from the disorder in Iran to expand Iraq's territories, especially in oil-rich areas. Iraq was supported by the USA, the USSR, France, the UK, Egypt, and the Arab countries. Currently, Iran is under sanctions from the West for its nuclear program. Regionally, it's exerting influence over traditional Persian space like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, but also Yemen. It's also improving its relations with China and Russia and is joining China-led international organizations like the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The Persian Empire today is known for being one of the most dominant and powerful empires throughout the course of history. Over thousands of years, the Persians have made numerous integral contributions to the world, from industry to culture.